Montana Territory. Spring of 1884, the wind came cutting down off the crazy mountains like it had a grudge, kicking dust over the high grass, and the blood trail that led right to the edge of the cottonwoods. Gideon Northam reined in his horse and studied the ground. "Fresh," he muttered. "Not more than an hour gone. One rider. Hurt bad." He dismounted, eyes narrowing as he followed the drag marks through the underbrush. His boots sank into soft earth, and just past a tangle of low brush he found her. She had a rifle half raised and blood soaking her right leg. Her dress was torn at the side, face scraped raw, but her grip on that gun never wavered. "I am not dying out here," she told him, voice rough, eyes locked on his. Gideon raised both hands. "Not planning on letting you." She looked at him like she did not believe it. But then the rifle barrel dipped just a little. He moved slow, crouching beside her. "Name's Gideon Northam. You, Fern," she said through gritted teeth. "Fern June." "All right, Fern June. That leg looks bad. You let me help or you bleed out." "Your call." She gave a short nod, then passed clean out. He worked fast, tying off her thigh with his belt and wrapping the wound as best he could. She had been shot clean through, likely by a small caliber pistol, maybe .32. Could have been worse. Still, the injury left her half-conscious and fevered by the time he got her into the saddle and rode toward his ranch. The Northam place sat low near the river bend, tucked in a hollow where cottonwoods leaned like weary old men. Gideon carried her inside and laid her on the spare bed, drawing the curtain to keep the morning light off her face. She was pale, jaw clenched, even unconscious. It took days for the fever to break. When she woke, startled and confused, he was sitting by the fire, boots off, shirt sleeves rolled. "Where am I?" she rasped. "My place, near Livingston. You lost a lot of blood." Fern tried to sit and winced, falling back. "Damn leg." "You keep cussing at it, it might just heal faster," he said, and something about the way he said it made her chest shake with a tired, unwilling laugh. He turned to look at her. "Guess you do smile." She shifted her gaze away, jaw tight. "What happened to my horse?" "Dead, couple miles back. Looks like someone chased you. You want to tell me who?" She hesitated, eyes going distant. "I stole back what was mine." "He tried to kill me for it." Gideon gave a slow nod. "He's still looking." Fern looked over at the satchel near the door. "Not anymore. I shot him. Think he bled out in the creek." He did not ask more than that, just brought her broth, helped her sit when the pain got worse. She never asked for help and never said thank you. But she let him stay nearby when the nightmares came. She was up on a crutch by the next week, limping slow around the cabin, stubborn as a mule. He caught her trying to split wood and took the axe from her hands. "You got about one working leg and no balance," he said. "Let me. You think I cannot do it just because I limp?" "I think you should not have to do it at all," he said, and she flinched like it was the first kind thing anyone had said to her in months. That night she sat beside him near the fire, listening to the wind. "You always live out here alone?" she asked. "Not always. My folks passed a few years back, been just me since." Fern nodded slowly. "I had a sister once, died in Texas. After that it was just me and my boys." Gideon turned, eyes narrowing. "Your boys?" she nodded. "Bram and Booker, 8 and 6. I left them with a friend in Miles City. Was supposed to be gone 3 days. It has been 2 weeks." He stood fast. "Then we ride at first light." She looked at him, startled. "You do not even know me." "Do not need to. You are a mother. That is enough." They left at dawn, Fern riding behind him, jaw clenched as the pain from her leg flared. She said nothing about it, just held tighter around his waist when the trail got rough. They reached Miles City on the 3rd day. The woman Fern had left her boys with was gone. House empty, windows boarded. A neighbor said she had skipped town the week before. Mentioned something about heading east, maybe Dakota Territory. Fern stood in the dirt road, breathing hard, fists clenched. "They are gone." Gideon stepped forward. "We will find them." "No," she said, turning away. "You have done enough. I am not leaving you like this." She looked back, eyes wet, jaw trembling. "Why, I do not know," he said. "Maybe because you limped into my life and now I cannot stop thinking about you." That made her laugh, sharp and broken. Then she looked down at her leg, at the old bandage. "I hate this limp." He stepped closer. "Guess you and that limp both kinda grew on me." Fern stared up at him. Then she kissed him. It was not gentle, it was not slow. It was desperate and grateful and aching all at once. When they pulled apart, she whispered, "I never thought I would feel safe again." "You are safe," he said. "And I am not going anywhere." The train yard was quiet under the gray morning light, only the crows making noise as they picked over scraps near the depot. Gideon stood beside Fern while the freight agent checked the manifests. She leaned on the crutch he'd carved down to fit her height, the raw wood smoothed where her hand had worn into it. "You sure she said Dakota Territory?" Gideon asked, watching the man thumb through the logbook. "That's what she told folks," the agent replied without looking up. "Was in a rush. Had 2 boys with her, one real talkative, other kept to himself." Fern's mouth thinned, but she said nothing. The agent finally looked up. "Train headed east left 5 days ago. Next one's this afternoon." "We'll be on it," Gideon said. Fern didn't speak until they were clear of the yard, moving slow along the boardwalk. "If she sold them off, She didn't," Gideon said. "You'd know. A mother knows." She didn't argue, but her grip tightened around the crutch. Gideon bought the tickets with the last of his ranch earnings, then bartered his saddle for 2 blankets and a week's worth of jerky and cornmeal. When he came back to the bench where Fern waited, she was watching a boy toss pebbles onto the tracks, his coat too long for his frame. "Booker always dragged his sleeves just like that," she said. "Said he liked the way they flapped when he ran." Gideon sat beside her, resting his hands on the rim of his hat. "You remember things clear." "I try not to." Her voice scraped low. "It hurts less if I don't." He didn't answer. Just shifted slightly so his shoulder touched hers. The train east was late. A cold rain started just before it arrived, and they boarded in silence. Inside, the benches were stiff, and the air smelled of wet wool and coal smoke. They sat near the back. Fern pressed against the window, watching the fields blur. By the 3rd day, the pain in her leg had sharpened again. She said nothing about it, but Gideon caught the way her teeth pressed together every time the train jolted. "Let me see it," he said once when they stopped to change engines in Bismarck. "No. You're hurting." She turned away. "I'm tired of being pitied. Ain't pity, it's care." She didn't answer, but when they boarded again, she let him help her up the steps. They found the woman Lola outside a boarding house in Mandan, unloading bags from a wagon. Fern spotted her first, face still and unreadable. Lola froze when she saw them. "I didn't know if you were alive." "You left," Fern said. "Didn't leave a word." "I was scared. Thought he might come looking for all of us." "Where are they?" Fern's voice had gone flat. Lola hesitated. "With a widow near the edge of town. She has land, no children. I paid her to look after them, made sure they'd be safe." "Take me," Fern said. They walked across town in silence. The house was small, with smoke curling from the stone chimney and a white sheet pinned to the line. Fern stopped at the gate, her hand on the post, eyes locked on the yard. 2 boys played with sticks in the dirt, one building a crooked fence from twigs, the other making hoarse sounds low in his throat. "Bram," she whispered. "That's Bram." She stepped through the gate, the crutch sinking in soft ground. The boys looked up, startled. Then Bram dropped his stick. "Mama!" Fern knelt before they reached her, arms wide, tears slipping down her cheeks as both boys barreled into her. Booker's small hands clutched her collar and Bram buried his face in her shoulder. "I'm sorry," she whispered into their hair. "Mama's here." "I'm here now." Gideon stood back, watching the three of them with a look that softened the edges of his face. He didn't move until Fern looked up, still holding her sons, and met his eyes. Later, after the boys had eaten and fallen asleep curled against her on the cot, Fern stepped outside. Gideon was beside the porch rail watching the stars. "They grew taller," she said. "You raised them right." She leaned on the rail beside him, arms folded. "I don't know what comes next." He looked at her, quiet for a long moment. "I got land, not much, but enough. Cabin's small, but there's room. For me and them." Her voice held something uncertain and hopeful. "For all of you," he said. "If you want it." She turned to face him. "You're not scared of a woman with a limp and a rattled past." "I'm scared of a quiet house and no one to laugh with," he said. "You and that limp both kinda grew on me." She laughed, warm and surprised, and stepped in close, her hand finding his. This time when she kissed him, it wasn't desperate, it was steady. "Sure." Like planting something deep in good earth. When they broke apart, she leaned her forehead against his. "I want that place," she said. "I want you in it." "Then it's yours," Gideon whispered. "All of it." And for the first time in years, Fern didn't feel like she was running. The wind was softer on the return ride west, brushing through the prairie like it meant to soothe rather than stir. The wagon Gideon bought in Mandan creaked beneath its load. Fern, her boys, and the few things they could carry. She sat up front beside him, one arm looped around Booker, who kept nodding off against her side. "You ever been west of Miles City?" Gideon asked as they passed a ribbon of river winding through cottonwood. "Once," Fern said. "Before Bram was born, just for a winter, didn't stay." He glanced at her. "Why not?" "Man, I was with liked whiskey more than fences. Thought the cold might sober him." "It didn't." She paused. "That was a long time ago." Booker stirred, half awake, and Gideon reached behind to tuck the blanket higher over him. The boy didn't wake fully, just sighed and settled again. Fern watched him. "They sleep easier when you're near." Gideon didn't say anything to that. Just flicked the reins gently. They camped near the Powder River that night, the boys curled in quilts inside the wagon bed while Gideon stoked the fire low. Fern stood nearby, hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee. Her crutch leaned against a log behind her. She hadn't used it much that day. "You think I'll always walk crooked?" she asked, keeping her voice low. "Maybe," Gideon said, "but I've seen folks crooked in worse ways." Fern looked sideways at him. "That meant to make me feel better." "No." He gave a short breath of laughter. "It just means it don't matter to me." She sipped the coffee, then sat beside him, stretching her legs toward the flames. The hem of her skirt was worn thin and the firelight caught the line of old mending. "You ever think about leaving all this?" she asked. "Once," he said. "After they died, I thought about heading down to Kansas. Maybe farther, but I've got that land. It's quiet, feels like something worth tending." Fern was silent for a while. The fire cracked softly between them. "You going to teach them?" she asked, nodding toward the wagon. "Teach them what?" She turned toward him, one brow lifted. "Fences, horses, that quiet land of yours. If they want to learn," he said, "I'll show them everything I know." She studied his face a moment. "They've never had a man who meant to stay." "They've got one now," Gideon said, steady as anything. She didn't kiss him then. Just leaned her head against his shoulder and let the silence settle deep around them. By the time they reached the ranch, the grass had greened, and the snowmelt had filled the creek. Booker ran ahead, chasing a rabbit that darted through the brush. Bram followed slower, eyes wide as he took in the low barn and the split-rail fence that circled the pasture. Fern stood in the yard, hands on her hips, watching the boys with a look Gideon hadn't seen before, half wonder, half disbelief. "You sure you want us here?" she asked, not looking at him. He stepped beside her. I want you exactly here. She turned to him fully then. I don't expect easy. I don't promise easy, he said, but I can promise you won't carry it alone. She reached for his hand, fingers rough and warm. You laugh different, she said suddenly, not like the men I knew before. He tipped his head. How's that? You laugh like I'm part of the joke, not the punchline. That made him laugh for real low and caught somewhere behind his ribs. I like that, she said, watching his face. I like you like that. He stepped in, brushing her cheek with his knuckles. Guess you and that Limp both kinda grew on me. I guess I'll keep both, she said, and kissed him like she meant it. Inside, Bram was already poking around the hearth, and Booker had found the old tin horse Gideon carved back when he was 12. Fern knelt beside them, showing them where the extra wool quilts were folded, where the coffee was kept, how to stack kindling by size. Later that night, after the boys had fallen asleep on the floor near the fire, Gideon and Fern stood in the doorway, watching the stars blink out one by one behind a bank of slow-moving clouds. You think it'll hold? She asked. This, he glanced at her. It already has. She leaned into him, her body warm against his side. I spent a long time thinking I wasn't worth staying for, she said. You were wrong, Gideon told her. Fern didn't answer, just nodded, eyes steady on the dark stretch of land that would now be theirs. And when she finally let out a breath, it sounded like something being set down after too long carried. Spring settled quiet over the valley, the kind that crept in slow and deliberate mud loosening to grass, the river swelling just enough to carry driftwood along its edges. Fern stood barefoot in the garden plot behind the cabin, sleeves rolled, hands sunk to the wrists in soil. Bram and Booker hunted earthworms nearby, competing to see who could find the fattest one. They'd been at it most of the morning, their voices carrying between the cottonwoods and the smokehouse. Gideon leaned on the split fence, watching her with a kind of stillness that wasn't common in men who spent their days with livestock and tools. She didn't ask how long he'd been standing there. She'd gotten used to his quiet, the way he didn't cut into moments just to fill the air. I've never planted anything this far north, she said without looking up. Back in Oklahoma territory, we couldn't keep tomatoes from splitting. Too dry. He stepped off the fence rail. So don't plant tomatoes. Stick to what grows easy here: onions, squash, maybe some beans. She brushed her hands off on her skirt and straightened. You always talk like the land's a person. It's temperamental enough, he said, glancing toward the tree line. You treat it right, it gives back. Get careless, it'll starve you. Fern nodded, then turned to where the boys were crouched in the dirt. They don't know this life yet. They miss street sounds, other children, even dust from wagon wheels. They'll learn, he said. You did. I didn't have a choice. He walked closer, stopping just short of where the tilled rows began. Neither did I, really. I just stayed still long enough for the place to settle into me. Fern looked at him, then really looked. You ever want more? His brow creased. More than what? Company. A bigger life. Something besides fence rails and early mornings. Gideon gave a faint shake of the head. My father used to say some men are made for motion and some are made for keeping things steady. I think I was built for the second. She lowered her gaze to the rows she'd carved with a hoe that morning. I used to think I was the first kind, always moving to stay ahead of something. You're not running now. No, she said. I'm not. They stood in silence, the kind that meant more than talk. Then Booker ran past them with a worm in each hand, shrieking as Bram gave chase. Fern caught Booker's arm before he could disappear around the corner of the cabin. Don't go near the barn without your boots on, she said, voice even. Booker pouted but obeyed, trudging back to the bucket with his prize. Gideon watched her. You handle them like you've always done it. You think I haven't. I think you've done it alone. That's different. She crossed her arms. You saying I shouldn't have? No, he said. I'm saying you don't have to anymore. Her mouth opened, then closed again. She looked down at her leg, flexed her foot once. You think I'm whole enough for this? He took 2 steps forward and placed a hand against her cheek. I've seen whole men do half what you've done. You're not broken. She closed her eyes just for a second. When she opened them again, they were clearer. I keep expecting the worst. Like it'll all be taken again. It won't, he said. Not while I've got breath. Fern studied the lines at the corners of his eyes, the way his jaw stayed steady no matter what came out of her mouth. Then she leaned forward, resting her forehead near his collarbone, not quite an embrace, but close. I want to believe that. Then let's start with today, he said. That's enough. They spent the afternoon fitting the garden fence, Fern on a stool hammering nails, Gideon sawing planks while Bram sorted them by length. They didn't speak much, but it was a working silence, comfortable in its rhythm. That evening, as the sun folded itself below the hills, Fern pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders and sat on the porch steps. Gideon came out with a cup of coffee and passed it to her. I know it's late, he said, but I've been thinking. She raised an eyebrow. There's a small schoolhouse a few miles north. Teachers older, might not come back after the summer. Fern turned to look at him, something cautious in her expression. You want me to teach? I want you to consider it. You read to them every night. You make them sit still and listen. That's more than most teachers can manage. She held the cup in both hands, letting the warmth soak in. I never had much schooling myself. You know more than most, he said, and you've got the heart for it. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, if I say yes, I still get to keep the garden, right? You get the garden, the boys, the cabin, he said, and me if you'll keep me. Fern laughed a low, surprised sound and looked over at him. You already know I will, he smiled, slow and sure. Good. Because you and that Limp both kinda grew on me. She bumped his shoulder with hers and leaned into him, not shy this time. The sky stretched wide above them, pale stars just beginning to show behind the dusk. Inside, the boys slept curled together, the way they always did after a full day outdoors. The air smelled of turned earth and fresh cut pine. Fern took a slow sip of her coffee, then reached for his hand without looking. And in that quiet, with nothing chasing them and nothing taken, they sat still enough for peace to settle in. The new schoolhouse stood on a gentle rise above the creek, a single-room structure with glass windows on the south wall and a stove at the center. Fern stepped inside just after sunrise, carrying a stack of slates under one arm and a cloth-wrapped bundle of chalk in the other. The air smelled of pine boards and ash. Gideon had chopped and stacked enough wood to last through the next frost. Bram and Booker trailed behind her, their boots freshly blackened with stove polish, hair combed and damp at the edges. They'd insisted on calling her Miss June all morning, faces solemn, though Booker had broken into a grin the moment Fern turned her back. She placed the slates on the front table and turned to face the room. You'll sit with the others just like everyone else, no speaking out, no complaints. Booker blinked. Even if the benches are hard, especially then, Fern said. By 8, 6 other children had arrived. They ranged from 5 to 11, most of them barefoot, a few with sunburned cheeks and hand-me-down coats. Fern greeted each one by name, noting the way some clung to their older siblings, others already eyeing the ink bottles on the shelf. She taught them letters first. Bram helped pass out practice sheets while Booker demonstrated how to hold the slate pencil without snapping it. When one boy grew restless and began tapping his heel against the floor, Fern paused beside him and placed one firm hand on his shoulder. He stilled without a word. At midday, Gideon arrived with a basket wrapped in muslin. He stayed by the door as the children poured outside to eat, eyes sweeping the room before settling on her. "I thought you might forget to eat," he said. "I didn't," Fern replied, but she took the basket anyway and peeled back the cloth. Inside were 2 biscuits, a slice of dried apple cake, and a small jar of blackberry preserves. She glanced up. "Blackberries this early? From preserves your boys helped me seal in the winter." Booker nearly ate half the jar before we got the lid on straight. Fern laughed softly and leaned against the table. "You always bring just what I need," he shrugged. "I watch close. You teach more than letters." After the children returned to their lessons, Gideon left without saying more, but Fern found herself glancing out the window every few minutes, just to see the edge of his coat as he walked toward the creek with his tools slung across his back. That evening, with the boys asleep across the cabin floor, Fern sat at the table, sorting through a pile of crude drawings. One of them, Booker's, showed a stick figure with a crutch standing beside a taller one with a hat. She traced her thumb over the uneven lines. When Gideon came in from the barn, he paused just inside the door. "You're tired." "I'm used to tired." "I know," he said and crossed to her, "but you don't have to be alone in it anymore." She set the drawing down and stood. "You've said things like that before." "Then let me say something different." He reached inside his coat and pulled out a folded square of paper. She took it, unfolding it slowly. Inside was a deed transfer his land, signed over to both their names. Fern stared at it, fingers tight around the edges. "You're giving me half your land. I'm giving you your life here, whatever shape it takes." She looked up at him, searching for hesitation. There wasn't any. "If I take it," she said, "it's not just for me. It's for Bram and Booker. It's all of us." "I know," he said. "That's why I wrote your name first." Fern didn't cry. She'd shed all her tears in other places, but she stepped forward and rested her head against his chest, her hands pressed flat over his ribs. "I never thought I'd be chosen," she whispered. "You weren't just chosen," Gideon said. "You were waited for." She tilted her face up and kissed him, slow and certain. There was no rush in it, no desperation, only the quiet surety of 2 people who had already endured the worst and come out with something whole between them. Months passed. The garden grew wild with squash and beans. Booker learned to tie fishing line without snarling the reel. Bram started carving shapes from driftwood. Fern taught the schoolchildren to read by lamplight when the days shortened, and Gideon built her a narrow shelf for the borrowed books. They passed from neighbor to neighbor. One evening, with the fire low and the lamp turned down, Fern laid the last mended shirt on the table and turned to find Gideon watching her. "I know we never said the words," she began. "I don't need them," he said. "I do," Fern said. "Because I mean them." She stepped forward, took his hands in hers. "I love you, Gideon Northam, not for what you gave, but for the way you stayed." He lifted her hands to his lips. "Then I'll keep staying every day you want me," and she did, every day. They were married on a cool September morning, with Bram and Booker standing as witnesses. No church, no preacher, just a binding recorded in the ledger at the county office and a ring Gideon had carved from an old silver coin. Fern wore a blue dress, the hem stitched with a line of white thread Booker had insisted on adding himself. That night, as the sun dipped low and the porch creaked beneath their weight, Fern leaned against Gideon's side, her hand resting over his. "I used to think peace was just the absence of trouble," she said. "And now I think it's this," she said. "Quiet days, shared work, love that doesn't leave." He turned his head, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Then let's keep it as long as we can." They did for years. Through dry seasons and good ones, through new students and growing boys, through sorrow when it came and laughter when it stayed. And every day, Gideon walked beside her, steady and warm, and Fern never once looked back.